Today, we will be talking about sexual reproduction. Let's begin with a brief overview. Sexual reproduction is the process in which there is successful fertilization of sex cells, also known as gametes, leading to the production of a new living organism. After the male sex cell, referred to as the sperm, fertilizes the female sex cell, also known as the egg or oocyte, a zygote is formed. This zygote begins dividing to form an embryo, before eventually forming a fetus if division continues successfully. Bar any complications, the few sex cells eventually develop into what we see as babies. The first thing we have to concern ourselves with regard to sexual reproduction is sex determination. As mentioned, a fetus is formed from the successful fertilization of two gametes, one from the father and one from the mother. These gametes are the key to determining sex, as all female mother gametes possess X chromosomes, while the father's sperm contains half X and half Y chromosomes. Depending on how the 23rd chromosomes pair, sex is determined as either male for an XY pair or female for an XX pair. Initially, when embryos are just developing, the sex glands are undifferentiated and only differentiate into the male and female reproductive organs and systems later on. This is controlled by the testis determining factor, which is a transcription factor promoting gene expression for testis development. TDF is present in males, while it is absent in females, as it is coded by the SRY gene, found only on the Y chromosome. Hormones play a big role in both male and female reproductive systems, as well as sexual reproduction as a whole. These hormones were briefly touched upon in my mind map on hormones, but we will be discussing a bit more here. The key male sex hormone is testosterone. It is produced by interstitial cells in the testes during the development of the male genitalia as well as during puberty. The secretion of testosterone during puberty leads to primary and secondary sexual characteristics, the production of sperm cells being the one to note to allow for sexual reproduction to take place. The male sex hormone is pretty straightforward. The female sex hormones, on the other hand, are a bit more complex. Estrogen and progesterone are the two key female sex hormones. They are both secreted by the ovaries, but perform slightly different functions. Estrogen is produced during development and puberty, the effect to note being the primary sex characteristic of egg release. The release of this egg during oogenesis is critical for sexual reproduction to occur. Progesterone is secreted during the menstrual cycle and pregnancy, where there are interesting relationships between the multiple hormones needed for successful oogenesis to occur. This concentration graph on the left illustrates these relationships. At the start of the menstrual cycle, gradual increases in follicle-stimulating hormone levels, FSH, initiates follicle development, kick-starting oogenesis. As the follicle develops, it begins secreting estrogen, which increases in concentration. This increase in estrogen has three effects. Number one, it stimulates the thickening of the endometrium in anticipation for implantation. Number two, it inhibits FSH, causing its levels to drop. This is an example of negative feedback, which is important as it prevents another follicle from developing, ensuring that only one follicle develops into an egg during oogenesis for every menstrual cycle. And number three, it stimulates the secretion of luteinizing hormone, LH. This is an example of positive feedback. And where's this luteinizing hormone secreted from? You guessed it. Just like the follicle-stimulating hormone, it is secreted by the master pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary gland to be exact, which has intricate control over the release of all hormones relating to sexual reproduction as a whole. You can fill in these blanks yourself. The sharp rise in luteinizing hormone triggers the bursting open of the follicular wall and the release of the oocyte, which is now ready for fertilization. This period corresponds to the ovulation period, which approximately occurs 14 days from the start of the menstrual cycle. Once ovulation has been completed, the ruptured follicle begins withering to form what is known as the corpus luteum, a cyst on the ovary, which now carries the important responsibility of secreting estrogen and progesterone, which are crucial for the processes that precedes ovulation. Progesterone, as mentioned, is needed for the continued repair and maintenance of the endometrium, as the uterus prepares for potential implantation. estrogen is needed to inhibit FSH and LH, essentially arresting a second menstrual cycle from taking place. Here, we see negative feedback occurring again. At this point, two things can happen. Either a successful fertilization of the released egg or not. If there is no fertilization and implantation, progesterone and estrogen levels eventually begin decreasing as the corpus luteum continues withering. The drop in levels of these two hormones causes the endometrium to begin breaking down as there is no longer progesterone needed to maintain it. This results in the menstrual flow that you may be familiar with. This period is referred to as the menstruation period of the menstrual cycle, which nicely brings the cycle to a close. Without any inhibitory effect, FSH slowly begins increasing, eventually leading to the start of a new cycle. If all this seems quite confusing to you, don't worry. When I first came across all these hormones and how they play into each other, I was a bit lost as well. I ask that you bear with me for a bit longer till we touch on the part of oogenesis, because the menstrual cycle will become much clearer when you understand the actual biological process that occurs in the ovaries. Before we move on to what happens if there is successful fertilization, I would like to highlight the importance of positive and negative feedback during the menstrual cycle. Feedback mechanisms commonly occur to control the levels of hormones in the bloodstream and is key to understanding how homeostasis is achieved. This has been discussed in my mind map on hormones and homeostasis, so do check it out for a better understanding. Link to the video is in the description below. Now back to sex. When there is successful fertilization of the released egg by male sperm, a zygote is formed that develops into an embryo. This embryo eventually implants into the endometrium, which we have been thickening for some time now, to form what is called a placenta. There are two functions of the placenta. Firstly, it takes over the role of progesterone and estrogen secretion that was previously carried out by the corpus luteum. The continued secretion of these two ovarian hormones is important to ensure that the endometrium is maintained to ensure the viability of the placenta and to prevent any new follicles from developing and rupturing. The other function the placenta holds is that of material exchange between the mother and the developing fetus. This occurs between the intervillous maternal blood spaces and the fetal capillaries. There are 3 adaptations of the placenta helping this exchange process that you will need to know. Firstly, there's a large surface area between the maternal and fetal blood for exchange to take place across. Secondly, the membranes separating the blood is very thin to allow for efficient exchange. And lastly, there is a rich supply of blood from the mother in the intervillous spaces for maximum possible exchange. It would be good to know these 3 adaptations by heart. Okay, so far we have covered the hormones involved in the development of our sex organ cells and the process of pregnancy. Now we reach the final push of birth, heavily controlled by hormones as well, which taps on a positive feedback mechanism. Once the fetus is fully developed, it begins stretching the walls of the uterus, which first stimulates the increase in the hormone estrol. Estrol initiates smooth muscle contractions of the uterus wall, which stimulates the release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary gland. Oxytocin causes further stronger contractions of the uterus wall, which creates a positive feedback cycle, as greater stimulation of stretch receptors causes even more oxytocin to be released. As such, contractions become stronger and stronger and stronger until eventually the baby is born. Now that we have covered the hormones involved in our reproductive system and processes, let's look into how gametes actually form. The formation of gametes corresponds nicely with hormone secretion, so I hope that this brings whatever we have discussed so far full circle, especially for the formation of the female gamete. Let's start with oogenesis here, which can be simply thought of as the development and release of an egg cell in the ovaries that corresponds with the menstrual cycle as illustrated here. Do follow along the oogenesis process with the menstrual cycle to see how the hormones come into play at each portion.